And we're going to finish up the 23rd chapter of David Copperfield. David and his aunt, Betsy Trotwood, are at the home of the lawyers that David is hoping to apprentice with. "Mr. Spenlow's in court, ma'am," said the dry man, "but it's close by, and I'll send for him directly." As we were left to look about us while Mr. Spenlow was fetched, I availed myself of the opportunity. The furniture of the room was old-fashioned and dusty, and the green baize on the top of the writing table had lost all its color, and was as withered and pale as an old pauper. There were a great many bundles of paper on it. Besides these, there were sundry immense manuscript books of evidence, tied together in massive sets. I was casting my eyes over these and many similar objects, when hasty footsteps were heard in the room outside, and Mr. Spenlow, in a black gown trimmed with white fur, came hurrying in, taking off his hat as he came. He was a little light-haired gentleman, with undeniable boots, and the stiffest of white cravats and shirt collars. He was buttoned up, mighty trim and tight, and must have taken a great deal of pains with his whiskers, which were accurately curled. His gold watch chain was so massive that a fancy came across me that he ought to have a sinewy golden arm to draw it out with, like those which are put up over the gold beaters' shops. He was got up with such care, and was so stiff that he could hardly bend himself, being obliged, when he glanced at some papers on his desk, after sitting down in his chair, to move his whole body from the bottom of his spine, like Punch. I had previously been presented by my aunt, and had been courteously received. He now said, "And so, Mr. Copperfield, you think of entering into our profession. I casually mentioned to Miss Trotwood, when I had the pleasure of an interview with her the other day," with another inclination of the body, Punch again, "that there was a vacancy here. Miss Trotwood was good enough to mention that she had a nephew who was her peculiar care, for whom she was seeking to provide gentility in life. That nephew, I believe, I have now had the pleasure of." Punch again. I bowed my acknowledgments, and said my aunt had mentioned to me that there was that opening, and that I believed I should like it very much, that although it was little else than a master of form, I presumed I should have the opportunity of trying how I liked it, before I bound myself to it irrevocably. "Oh, surely, surely," said Mr. Spenlow. "We always in this house propose a month, an initiatory month. I should be happy, myself, to propose 2 months, 3, an indefinite period, in fact, but I have a partner, Mr. Jorkins." "And the premium, sir," I returned, "is £1,000. "And the premium, stamp included, is £1,000, said Mr. Spenlow. "As I have mentioned to Miss Trotwood, I am actuated by no mercenary considerations. Few men are less so, I believe, but Mr. Jorkins has his opinion on these subjects, and I am bound to respect Mr. Jorkins' opinions. Mr. Jorkins thinks £1,000 too little, in short." "I suppose, sir," said I, still desiring to spare my aunt, "that it is not the custom here. If an article clerk were particularly useful, and made himself a perfect master of his profession—" I could not help blushing, this looked so like praising myself. "I suppose it is not the custom in the latter years of his time to allow him any—" Mr. Spenlow, by great effort, lifted his head far enough out of his cravat to shake it, and answered it, anticipating the word salary. "No, I will not say what consideration I have made to give that point myself, Master Copperfield. If I were unfettered, Mr. Jorkins is immovable." I was quite dismayed by the idea of this terrible Jorkins, but I found out afterwards that he was a mild man of heavy temperament, whose place in the business was to keep himself in the background, and be constantly exhibited by name as the most obdurate and ruthless of men. If a clerk wanted his salary raised, Mr. Jorkins wouldn't listen to such a proposition. If a client were slow to settle his bill of costs, Mr. Jorkins was resolved to have it paid. And however painful these things might be, and always were to the feelings of Mr. Spenlow, Mr. Jorkins would have his bond. The heart and hand of the good angel Spenlow would have been always open, but for the restraining demon Jorkins. As I have grown older, I think I have had experience of some other houses doing business on the principle of Spenlow and Jorkins. It was settled that I should begin my month's probation as soon as I pleased, and that my aunt need neither remain in town nor return at its expiration. As I knew she was anxious to get home, I urged her not to be uncomfortable on my account, but to leave me to take care of myself. "I have not been here a week tomorrow without considering that too, my dear," she returned. With this brief introduction, she produced from her pocket an advertisement, carefully cut out of a newspaper, setting forth that in Buckingham Street, in the Adelphi, there was to be let, furnished with a view of the river, a singularly desirable and compact set of chambers, forming a genteel residence for a young gentleman, terms moderate, and could be taken for a month only if required. Why, this is the very thing, aunt," said I, flushed with the possible dignity of living in chambers. "Then come," replied my aunt. "We'll go and look at them." Away we went. The advertisement directed us to apply to Mrs. Krupp on the premises, and we rang the area bell, which we supposed to communicate with Mrs. Krupp. It was not until we had rung it 3 or 4 times that we could prevail on Mrs. Krupp to communicate with us, but at last she appeared, being a stout lady, with a flounce of flannel petticoat below a nankeen gown. "Let us see these chambers of yours, if you please, ma'am," said my aunt. "For this gentleman?" said Mrs. Krupp, feeling in her pocket for her keys. "Yes, for my nephew," said my aunt. "And a sweet set they is for sich," said Mrs. Krupp. So we went upstairs. They were on the top of the house, a great point with my aunt, being near the fire escape, and consisted of a little half-blind entry where you could see hardly anything, a little stone-blind pantry where you could see nothing at all, a sitting room and a bedroom. The furniture was rather faded, but quite good enough for me, and sure enough, the river was outside the windows. As I was delighted with the place, my aunt and Mrs. Krupp withdrew into the pantry to discuss the terms, while I remained on the sitting-room sofa, hardly daring to think it possible that I could be destined to live in such a noble residence. After a single combat of some duration, they returned. Is this the last occupant's furniture?" inquired my aunt. "Yes, it is, ma'am," said Mrs. Krupp. "What's become of him?" asked my aunt. Mrs. Krupp was taken with a troublesome cough, in the midst of which she articulated with very much difficulty. "He was took ill here, ma'am, and oh, dear me, and he died." "Hey, what did he die of?" asked my aunt. "Well, ma'am, he died of drink," said Mrs. Krupp in confidence, "and smoke." "Smoke? You don't mean chimneys?" said my aunt. "No, ma'am," returned Mrs. Krupp. "Cigars and pipes." "That's not catching trot, at any rate," remarked my aunt. "No, indeed," said I. In short, my aunt, seeing how enraptured I was with the premises, took them for a month, with leave to remain for 12 months. When that time was out, Mrs. Krupp was to find linen and to cook. Every other necessity was also provided, and Mrs. Krupp expressly intimated that she should always yearn toward me as a son. I was to take possession the day after tomorrow, and Mrs. Krupp said, thank heaven, she had now found someone she could care for. And that is the end of chapter 23.